The missiles didn't just fall, they rewrote the rules of war. It was supposed to be a moment of celebration, a small makeshift beauty salon in the West Bank, really just a converted caravan, buzzing with laughter, chatter, anticipation. Women preparing for Eid, a rare moment of normal life in a region that hasn't known peace in decades. And then a flash, a scream, and silence. In seconds, at least 3 women were dead. Others lay wounded. The salon gone. The joy gone. And what replaced it was something far more dangerous than grief: uncertainty. Because no one could even agree on what had just happened. Was it an Iranian missile? Or was it a failed Israeli defense system? A mistake? A misfire? Or something worse? A sign that this war has already spiraled beyond control. This wasn't just another strike. This was the first deadly attack on Palestinians in the West Bank since the war began. And that changes everything. Because until now, this war, exploding between Iran, Israel, and backed heavily by the United States, had boundaries, invisible lines, rules that kept certain areas, certain populations, just slightly outside the direct line of fire. Those lines are now gone. And here's the real question no one in Washington, London, or Ottawa can afford to ignore. If missiles are now falling in places they weren't supposed to, what happens when they start landing somewhere even bigger? Because at the exact same time this tragedy unfolded, something even more alarming was happening hundreds of miles away. Iran wasn't just firing missiles, it was targeting the global energy system. Qatar, one of the world's largest natural gas producers, was suddenly under attack. Massive energy facilities hit, fires erupting, exports slowing to a crawl. Saudi Arabia, also under fire. The United Arab Emirates, impacted by falling debris from intercepted missiles. And suddenly, this isn't just a regional war anymore. This is a global pressure point. Oil prices surged past $110 a barrel almost instantly. Stock markets trembled. Governments scrambled behind closed doors. Because when energy supply is threatened in the Persian Gulf, the ripple effects don't stay there. They hit gas prices in Texas, heating bills in London, food supply chains in Canada. And as the world begins to feel those first economic tremors, another layer of this crisis is quietly unfolding in Washington. Because the intelligence community is starting to push back. Officials have begun to publicly question one of the central claims behind the war, the idea that Iran posed an immediate long-range missile threat to the United States. According to U.S. intelligence leadership, Iran may not even have that capability for years. So now, the stakes aren't just military, they're political. And at the center of it all is Donald Trump, a president who justified war on urgency, on imminent danger, on a ticking clock. But what if that clock wasn't real? And as these questions grow louder, the battlefield is getting more chaotic by the hour. Iran's leadership is being systematically targeted. High-ranking officials eliminated one after another. The government weakened, but not collapsed. Inside Iran, civilians are living under constant bombardment, explosions day and night, entire neighborhoods shaking, families running for cover. Fear is turning into anger, and anger into something much more dangerous. Because history has shown us this: when a nation feels cornered, isolated, and under siege, it doesn't back down. It escalates. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. Missiles aren't just hitting military targets anymore. They're hitting infrastructure, energy, civilians, and perhaps most dangerously, expectations. Because the world expected this war to be controlled, measured, strategic. But what we're watching instead looks a lot like something slipping out of control. And if that's true, then what happened in that small salon in the West Bank wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning, a preview of what happens when modern warfare stops being precise and starts becoming unpredictable. And the real story? It's only just beginning. To understand how we got here, you have to rewind the clock. Not days, not weeks, years. Because this war didn't begin with a missile strike. It began with a belief. A belief inside Washington that Iran was not just a regional rival, but a long-term existential threat. For decades, tensions simmered between Iran and the United States. Sanctions, proxy conflicts, cyber warfare, political standoffs. But it never fully exploded into direct confrontation, until now. When Donald Trump returned to power, he didn't just revive old policies, he accelerated them. His administration framed Iran as a ticking time bomb, a nation on the verge of developing advanced missile capabilities that could eventually threaten not just allies, but the U.S. homeland itself. That narrative mattered, because it justified action, and action came fast. In late February, the United States, alongside Israel, launched a massive campaign targeting Iran's military and energy infrastructure, airstrikes, precision hits, strategic assassinations. High-ranking officials inside Iran began falling one by one. Names that once held power in Tehran suddenly became headlines, and then obituaries. The goal? Cripple the leadership, break the system, force Iran into submission, or collapse. But here's where the plan started to unravel. Because Iran didn't collapse, it adapted. Instead of retreating, it retaliated. And not just symbolically. Ballistic missiles began raining down on Israel. Drones crossed borders into the Gulf. And suddenly, countries that weren't even direct participants in the war found themselves in the crossfire. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Energy infrastructure, arguably the most sensitive and globally impactful targets in the region, became primary objectives. Why? Because Iran understood something critical. If you can't win the war militarily, you expand the battlefield economically. And nothing shakes the global economy faster than energy disruption. That's where South Pars comes in. This isn't just another gas field. It's the heart of Iran's energy system, responsible for nearly 70% of its natural gas production. When it was struck, reportedly by Israeli forces, it wasn't just a military move. It was a strategic gamble. Because hitting energy infrastructure doesn't just weaken your enemy, it destabilizes the entire region. And Iran's response? Immediate, fierce, and calculated. Missiles aimed at Qatar's gas facilities, drone attacks targeting Saudi infrastructure, threats issued across the Persian Gulf warning that no energy site was safe. Within hours, global markets reacted. Oil prices surged, gas exports slowed, shipping routes became dangerous, and suddenly, the world realized something uncomfortable. This war wasn't contained, it was spreading. Meanwhile, inside Iran, a different kind of crisis was unfolding, an information blackout. For nearly 3 weeks, most of the country has been cut off from the internet, communication restricted, information tightly controlled. Why? Because governments don't just fight wars on the battlefield. They fight them in the narrative. And Iran needed control over what its people were seeing, hearing, and believing. But even without the internet, reality couldn't be hidden. Airstrikes hitting residential neighborhoods, entire buildings collapsing, families fleeing cities they once thought were safe. The war was no longer distant, it was personal. And that's where things get even more complicated. Because while Iran's leadership has been weakened, it hasn't been removed. U.S. intelligence confirms the system is still intact, still functioning, still capable of making decisions, which means this war is far from over. And back in Washington, cracks are beginning to show. Intelligence officials are now publicly stating that Iran's long-range missile capability, the very threat used to justify this war, may not materialize until 2035. That's nearly a decade away. So now a new question is emerging. Was this war launched too soon? Or worse, Was it launched on a flawed premise? Because if the threat wasn't immediate, then the consequences we're seeing now, global instability, rising oil prices, civilian casualties, become much harder to justify. And as pressure builds, both internationally and domestically, the narrative is starting to shift. This is no longer just about stopping Iran. It's about what this war is becoming. A conflict that is no longer predictable, no longer contained, and no longer easy to control. And as we move into the next phase, the most dangerous part isn't what's already happened. It's what might happen next. At first, it looked like strategy. Now, it looks like chaos. Because what we're witnessing isn't just escalation, it's acceleration. Every day, the war is moving faster, spreading wider, and hitting harder. And the scariest part? No one seems fully in control anymore. Let's start with the battlefield itself. Iran is launching waves of missiles, not all of them precise. Some are cluster munitions, designed to scatter smaller explosives over wide areas. That means even when they miss their intended targets, they still hit something. Homes, roads, civilian infrastructure, and sometimes places like that beauty salon in the West Bank. At the same time, Israel's defense systems are intercepting many of these threats, but interception isn't clean. When a missile is destroyed mid-air, debris rains down over a wide radius. Shrapnel becomes its own weapon, and suddenly, even defense creates danger. This is what modern warfare looks like when it starts to spiral. Not clean lines, not clear targets, just overlapping destruction. And while civilians are paying the price on the ground, governments are reacting in ways that could make everything worse. Qatar has already taken a major step, expelling Iranian officials and issuing direct warnings. Saudi Arabia is intercepting incoming threats over its capital. The UAE is dealing with fallout, literally, from intercepted strikes. Each of these countries is now being pulled deeper into the conflict, whether they want to be or not. And this is where global powers start to get nervous, because the Persian Gulf isn't just a region, it's a lifeline. Roughly 1/3 of the world's oil passes through it. Disrupt that flow, and you don't just get higher gas prices, you get inflation, supply chain breakdowns, economic instability across continents, and we're already seeing the early signs. Markets dropping in Asia, investors pulling back, central banks reconsidering interest rate cuts. This isn't just a war anymore, it's an economic shockwave. But there's another layer to this story, one that's less visible, but just as important. Inside Iran, the mood is changing. What started as fear is turning into anger. People are watching their neighborhoods get bombed, infrastructure destroyed, leaders assassinated. And instead of weakening resolve, it's strengthening it. Because there's a psychological shift that happens during prolonged conflict. The enemy becomes clearer, the stakes become personal, and compromise becomes less likely. This is exactly what Western strategists fear most. A prolonged war doesn't just drain resources, it hardens positions. And as Iran becomes more entrenched, its responses become more aggressive, more unpredictable, more dangerous. And then there's the political dimension. Back in the United States, pressure is building. Questions about the intelligence behind the war, concerns about economic fallout, fears of deeper entanglement. Because history has shown that wars in the Middle East rarely stay limited. They expand, they draw in allies, they create new fronts, and sometimes they last far longer than anyone expects. Even within the administration, there are signs of tension. Intelligence assessments are starting to diverge from political messaging. And when that happens, credibility becomes an issue. Because once the public starts questioning the why behind a war, support becomes fragile. And without strong public support, sustaining a prolonged conflict becomes much harder. Meanwhile, on the global stage, leaders are calling for restraint. France is pushing for a moratorium on attacks against civilian infrastructure. Others are urging de-escalation. But here's the problem. De-escalation requires trust. And right now, trust is in short supply. Each side believes it's responding, not provoking. Each strike is seen as justified. Each retaliation as necessary. And that's how conflicts spiral. Not through one massive decision, but through a series of smaller ones that no one wants to back down from. And now, we're approaching a tipping point. Because the longer this continues, the higher the chances of a major miscalculation. A strike that hits the wrong target. A missile that lands in the wrong city. An escalation that pulls in a new global power. And when that happens, this war won't just be about Iran and Israel anymore. It will be something much bigger, something far harder to contain, and possibly something the world isn't ready for. So where does this go from here? That's the question leaders around the world are asking behind closed doors. Because right now, there are only three possible paths forward, and none of them are simple. The first is escalation. Full-scale, uncontrollable escalation. More strikes, more countries pulled in, more infrastructure destroyed. In this scenario, the Persian Gulf becomes a war zone. Energy exports collapse. Oil prices skyrocket, possibly beyond anything we've seen in decades. Global economies take a hit. Recession becomes a real possibility. And the conflict itself? It expands beyond anything originally planned. The second path is stalemate. A prolonged, grinding conflict where neither side gains a decisive advantage. Missiles continue, airstrikes continue, casualties rise, but no clear victory emerges. This is the most likely scenario in the short term, and historically, it's also the most dangerous. Because long wars don't just drain resources, they create unpredictability. They open the door for new players. They increase the risk of sudden escalation, and they slowly normalize conflict. The third path is de-escalation, diplomatic pressure, back-channel negotiations, a gradual reduction in hostilities. But here's the reality. De-escalation requires both sides to step back. And right now, neither side is ready to do that. Because politically, backing down looks like weakness. And in a war like this, perception matters just as much as reality. Meanwhile, the global impact is already unfolding. Energy markets remain volatile, shipping routes are under threat, and governments in the US, UK, and Canada are preparing for the economic fallout. Higher fuel prices, rising inflation, potential supply disruptions. This isn't something that stays overseas. It shows up at gas stations, in grocery stores, in monthly bills. And then there's the long-term question. What does this war change? Because every major conflict reshapes the world in some way. It alters alliances, redefines power structures, creates new realities. And this one? It's already shifting the balance in the Middle East. Iran, despite heavy losses, is proving it can still project power. Israel is demonstrating its reach, but also its vulnerabilities. And the United States? It's once again deeply involved in a region it has struggled to stabilize for decades. And at the center of it all is a single uncomfortable truth. This war may have been easier to start than it will be to end. Because wars driven by fear, uncertainty, and competing narratives don't have clean conclusions. They evolve, they linger, they reshape the world in ways no one fully predicts. And that brings us back to where we started, that small salon in the West Bank, a place that should have been far from the front lines, a place that should have been safe, but wasn't. Because in modern warfare, there are no truly safe places anymore. And if this conflict continues on its current path, that reality won't just apply to the Middle East. It will apply to the entire world. The only question left is, how far will it go before someone finally decides to stop it?